Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And about a week ago, I put out a compilation video of all the albums that I would consider my favorites coming out of 2020. Coming together from all those episodes of On the Pulse and just bringing them all together into one place. Today we're getting the other half of that particular side of things for the albums I did not like to the same degree. You'll notice a few things right out of the gate with this. The first being that this video is considerably shorter. You know, for as many times as people call me a hater, which I'm just a harsh critic, hating things for its own sake seems really boring and tiresome, and frankly I don't have time for it. But there is a list of albums I don't like, and while I did often wind up saying more about the albums, this video is a lot shorter. That's because of the albums that I did not like, as in giving a score of 4 out of 10 or lower, there's just fewer of them. Now, part of that is because I don't review everything I dislike that I hear. I have limited amounts of time, and the less time I give to bad music, the happier I am. But there's a lot of albums that are on this list, about 30 plus, but in comparison with the number of albums that I really loved, this number is significantly smaller. So when you call me a hater sometimes, yeah, there's stuff that's worse out there, and this is the list of a bunch of them. The other thing I want to say, and this ties into me being a little bit more positive overall, or at least trying to be, it comes with the fact that a lot of the bad albums that I hear, there's different grades of badness, at least in terms of how I would structure a lot of this list. I might hear a lot of bad music, but there's difference between the bad that comes off a major label, where really they have enough money and privilege for there to be no excuse, and the bad that comes from an amateur who's just starting off, just learning the ropes, and just might not be there yet. Furthermore, there's also a few artists that put albums on my schedule, courtesy of Patreon. I didn't like them. I was actually pretty harsh in a lot of my critiques of them, and they are not included on this list. They asked for me to review their projects in my regular series. Putting them in an additional compilation just feels like punching down, and I'm not about to do that. This feels not altogether classy. So, you got all that? Good, because we got a lot of stuff that's not all that good, starting with... Next, from Bombay Bicycle Club, Everything Else Has Gone Wrong.
Come and see you tonight.
You hear a lot of critics get really angry at the commodification of indie rock these days, but I got a theory it's partially their own damn fault. Who else would have given this lukewarm pass to thoroughly milquetoast and mediocre indie acts who got just enough cred to mass market their trend chasing and their increasingly anonymous pablum, with the delusion that a good guitar rollick can overcompensate for having no personality or unique charisma anywhere else, especially in the vocals and writing. And we want a particularly shameless example of this, Bombay Bicycle Club, who spent most of the 2010s trend hopping and going into a pop-adjacent adult alternative sound before going on hiatus. And look, the most common defense for Bombay Bicycle Club is, even by most of the fans, is that for as derivative and lightweight as they are, they're ultimately kind of harmless. They can make some catchy tunes that might stick in your head, that's fine. And in this case, a slightly brighter sense of elbow-esque commercial-ready flash that's time-locked in 2014, that might not be bad, right? Well, there's 3 major problems with that. Number 1, the gated and stuttering percussion doesn't work to blend any sense of groove, and opposite John Congleton's production and the gurgling, over-processed synth and guitar blend, it feels really awkwardly blocky where it should be breezy. Number 2, Jack Steadman still has no distinctive personality as a singer or a writer, and his attempts to ramp up a crescendo feel clunky as all hell. And number 3, most exasperatingly, it's an album that's trying to translate its writer's block and undercooked relationship songs into compelling drama, and then winds up in the fetal position, especially in the face of awareness of real-world issues where they're being referenced to sound timely, but never seriously digging into them, because this band is privileged to the point where they don't really have to, but they want to appropriate the urgency for their framing. It's the same myopia that seriously tainted Vampire Weekend's last release, and pretty much the entire career of AJR, and yet, while there's a sort of audience for this gutless but blissful escapism, no, I can't stomach this. Pull the else out of your album titled Bombay Bicycle Club. That might have been a bit more honest. 4 out of 10, avoid it. And finally, from Eminem, Music to be Murdered to.
In the darkness, I don't wanna be alone in the darkness.
You know, I said on Twitter that even as a longtime Eminem fan, I would have been comfortable with Joe Budden ending M's career at any time now. And then I heard Joe Budden's podcast, where you can tell he's still a little bothered by some of the passing jibes, but in essence, he's moved on. Oh, it's M who has been stewing in bitterness and frustration at the haters as the flows will get faster and less coherent. The filler bars and the horrible punchlines. They already make this hour-plus album full of clunky drums, auto-tune concessions to modernity, and inconsistent vocal mastering a real chore. And songs like Marsh are absolutely that. But it's the change in ideology and subtext that just kills any replay value for me. It's got the feeling of watching a politically insightful comedian right after a social media backlash, rightful or not, where the majority of the jokes in the set are just an extended rant on that backlash, and when they're not, because that's where his mind is, the jokes just kind of suck. I think there'll be some overlap between the audience that gets off on that and this Eminem album, but what's so disappointing is that M used to hold up a mirror to that audience and seriously challenge that perspective, not give them, and by extension himself, a pass. And it's a single darkness that actually really proved it for me. Spoken from the interweaving perspective of a man who shoots up a concert and someone who's overdosing on pills and alcohol, that same sort of performer, but where in the past it was often a point surrounding artistic suicide, here M says we can't know the rationale of those mass shooters, those who will self-destruct and hurt others. Except we do. We've seen manifestos. More than ever, the ideologies are understood. And he knows that we know this, because if there's an artist who's explored white male psychopathy more, it's Eminem. So where the hell does that white privilege reversal on Leaving Heaven come from? And how did Royce let you get away with that, given his verse on You Gonna Learn? Where's the self-awareness? Where's the deeper deconstruction? Where's any sort of deeper personal storytelling beyond self-indulgent fantasies like Stepdad? The hookup jams that were cringy even when M was in his prime. Someone please tell him to stop working with Ed Sheeran, my god. But where even the most tolerable moments are facsimiles of songs that M has made before. Never Love Again? It's 25 to life, but swapping out hip-hop for drugs. Stepdad is a revenge fantasy that was more visceral and insane and more impactful in his first verse of Sing for the Moment. And I swear he's retold that same bad relationship song on In Too Deep and Farewell dozens of times now. What frustrates me the most is that Eminem is often the most distracting part of his own songs, where on Godzilla with Juice WRLD he'll spiral off beat into a ream of blisteringly fast filler and bad lines, or the weird penchant for dad joke punchlines that he'll then explain and then destroy any sense of darker atmosphere, or that way then will flash this ugly no apologies defensiveness that is not only monumentally insecure, it's also wildly hypocritical, because embracing the victim complex while framing himself as the winner, it's the worst sort of direction for him. I mean, why else did you assemble every member of Slaughterhouse except Joe Budden on I Will, and then fill your verse with Lord Jamar shots and DaBaby jokes, and then still miss Joe's overall point about bad business by not giving Griselda the time of day to elevate them on your label, especially after their last year? They could have loved that push. But at the end of the day, again, like so many guys my age, Eminem was one of my first introductions to rap music and hip-hop culture. I think the big difference now is that I've moved on from that time and that limited perspective, and he really hasn't. Which for a rap nerd like him, me watching, it's incredibly disappointing. Especially when his tentative steps to modernize, they feel so clumsy and awkward, where those that he's inspired are now kind of passing him by. And you know what, that's his lane now. He's always gonna have that crew of white guy stans who will miss the point of that song and ride or die in that lane. But I'm taking the exit out, especially when it feels like such an artistic regression across the board. This music ain't killing me or killing for me. I just really wish it could. Very late 4 out of 10. It's only for the stands now. They probably won't get that joke. And finally, from Twin Atlantic, Power. Okay, this is just a disclaimer for patrons here. If you're gonna request utterly milquetoast alternative rock that doesn't give me a lot to say, that's exactly the commentary you're gonna get. And if we're looking for the newest example, Twin Atlantic. On their early 2010s debut, they sounded like Gerard Way became Scottish, hired a really good bassist, and then proceeded to make the most indistinct radio rock imaginable. And unfortunately, it's only uneven from there. A bland and flatly produced stab at Switchfoot-esque power pop on their sophomore album. Their third album kept the same flat production, then went for an overblown, flat radio rock fuzziness that was a welcome improvement and could have still hit quality if the writing wasn't still milquetoast and the early 2010s garage blues revival didn't exist. And with this, can we say Imagine Dragon? Yeah, borrowing a meme from my boy Crash Thompson, but for as late as Twin Atlantic has been in chasing the trends, it's sadly no surprise they wound up here 2 years late with all the gated 80s percussion, clicking snaps, scratchy stuttering, gummy buzzsaw synths, ugly vocal pitch shifting, and crushing their reverb guitars into buzzy mush. There's no trap percussion, which seemed to imply the deeper influence might be the 1975 or maybe the Wombats, but it's an awful sign when a forgettable band hops on a bad trend and their most distinctive sound becomes their worst. I mean, by the Nine Hills, there's an interlude here called Mount Bungo that literally sounds like elongated, synthesized farts. Factor in truly awful sequencing, half-formed failures at synthwave groove like I Feel It Too, or just ripping off Depeche Mode wholesale with Messiah, and then a very incoherent, late-night, brooding album narrative with some painfully limited and basic poetry, and the fact that the entire album reads like an attempt to replicate Glitterbug 5 years too late. Yeah, this sucks. Was like the power Twin Atlantic needed? Just to be terrible all along. 3 out of 10, avoid this. And finally, from Lil Wayne, Funeral.
Thank God it was just a dream!
Am I the only one seeing a parallel between the new releases of Lil Wayne and Eminem this past month? Way too long, indulgent, questionable production choices and guest stars, where both rappers, they do seem sharp and focused until you start digging into what they're actually saying and find all the inexcusable corniness and cringe, because nobody would actually say no to them. The larger problem with Lil Wayne is that he douses himself in auto-tune to do it, which would be fine if it contributed to a unique aesthetic or showed himself innovating with that sound or production. He's got no reason not to, but in reality, Lil Wayne is playing in much of the same territory as so many of his descendants. And while he tends to be a more interesting rapper than many of them in wordplay and flow alone, at least when he cares to be, over the course of 24 songs without any real consideration for sequencing or storytelling, it gets really repetitive. Flexing, drug abuse, and doing drugs off of women's body parts in increasingly graphic fashion, by now it's par for the course from Lil Wayne, so I just don't get shocked or mortified in the same way anymore. And it's just not even that funny in the same way. At least in the Carter 5, there were songs like Mona Lisa that told a story and had a lot of character that stood out. I'd put Uproar in that case too. Here it just sounds like mixtape Wayne on a full-length album, and it reminded me exactly why I stopped listening to Lil Wayne tapes and albums. They just started running together. He's put out so many. Now, I've heard this project gets a little better if you treat it like a playlist and just pick the songs you like the title track, Harden, or maybe even Dreams and Nevermind for me, but I'm also stuck considering Funeral as a whole. And when you factor in some truly awful songs and how so many bad bars and questionable beats overshadow so much of the good stuff, yeah, sorry Wayne, I can't endorse this. Strong 4 out of 10, and you know what, even for the fans, I think they know he's done better. Next up from Green Day, Father of All Motherfuckers. No, hang on, that's not right. I was very plainly told this is the newest album from Foxborough Hot Tubs. What is this nonsense about a new Green Day album? But, setting jokes aside, what immediately struck me surrounding this project, besides the cringy marketing, was a get off my lawn meme that fellow critic Mike Seatown made on Twitter in response to Green Day. Kind of ironic, because at this point, Green Day are so indebted and borderline obsessed with rock's past that they could double as the person in that meme. And yet, while that's always been somewhat true, I've heard 21st Century Breakdown, that's what was once distracting in the 2000s is now starting to get actively draining and tiresome in 2020. Again, nothing wrong with pulling from the past so much as you can build on it, make something unique, not feel like a retread or awkward or overloaded with self-congratulations, which is where this stumbles hard. I made the observations before that Billy Joe Armstrong seems to have a bit of a Peter Pan complex going back to the trilogy, but it's on full display here in both his groan-inducing falsetto and the hypocrisy. You want to call out Modern Acts for sampling while you're Green Day, and you've been lifting riffs from classic rock and punk for decades now, and even more so here with flagrant retreads like the Joan Jett lift on Oh Yeah and from Little Richard on Stab You in the Heart, most obviously, just comes with a lingering immaturity and a lack of subtlety that cements the evidence that Green Day's not aging well, trying to pick up traces of adulthood, but none of that introspection or weight, which I know they've had in the past. And it gets even more ugly when you combine that with Butch Walker's increasingly rubbery, blocky, yet blown-out production choices, especially in the lead-in percussion lines and the horrible vocal mixing, all of which coalesce in the hideous clunker song Junkies on a High, and then you follow it with underweight and increasingly slapdash writing trying so hard to relate to the kids, and falling so very flat, with cuts like I Was a Teenager. Billy Joe, did you somehow think that just because they were into retro, you'd get here 5 years late and win them over with this terribly mixed pastiche? Hell, in the case of Sugar Youth, you're ripping off yourselves. We remember She's a Rebel. I mean, the best thing I can say is there's a few really solid guitar lines, like the solo on Meet Me on the Rooftop, and the grubby, flattened garage tones of Take the Money and Crawl. But when it's juxtaposed opposite the awful backing vocal blending and the utterly self-indulgent choice to add crowd cheers to a couple songs, not the album to do that. And yeah, this isn't very good. It's not their worst while Dose still exists, but it's close. 4 out of 10, I can't recommend it, and Green Day, I'm a fan, but this ain't it. And finally, from Justin Bieber, Changes. Honest question. As somebody who is not a fan of Justin Bieber, and probably never will be, what does he add to any music that's unique in terms of personality or flair? Because while Purpose 5 years ago seemed to provide at least some sort of solid pop songs and intriguing production to have a way better than expected chart run, it seems like both the critical and popular tides are starting to turn on Justin Bieber yet again, and I'm stuck asking the hard question of what he really adds to the current mainstream pop ecosystem. Because it's not like he's innovating or chasing a new sound on this album. The title, it's a complete misnomer, because if I wanted to hear a bunch of Drake's rejects from 2018 with phoned-in guest verses, hell, I'd probably just go back to listen to Scorpion and then shoot myself. Now, you would think for an artist who is a presumed A-lister that you get production that's got some sort of unique flair or style, but we don't even get consistent mix quality, because the hip-hop percussion nearly always sounds flat and over-mixed opposite warbling synth touches, chipmunk vocal fragments, leaden beats, and if we're lucky, or unlucky, if you look at the horribly tinny pickup on That's What Love Is, an acoustic guitar that makes you reminisce on how Justin Bieber can only really go back to the same well since his YouTube roots, and then he'll be thoroughly outshone by Shawn Mendes. And when you have a project that already runs long and with such flat instrumentals, your attention will naturally drift to the lyrics. And here's the thing, even if I think that Justin Bieber doesn't have much unique vocal personality as a singer, at least on Journals and Purpose, you got the impression that there could be something to him as a songwriter. Not particularly likable songwriter, but that could at least make him sound interesting. Whereas Changes sounds like he bought a bunch of songs from professional songwriters, and there's not a single risk to break outside of an already dated, market-tested formula. In fact, when it does try to be a little more interesting, it's got the overwritten quality of a focus group trying to synthesize any sort of emotion, which can work if you get a frontman who can sell thoughtfulness or intellect or has real charisma, but this is Justin Bieber, who wants to get it in expeditiously. A word I'm fairly certain he has never used before Come Around Me. Now this is where I would go to the other names to find something. It's a risky bet because nearly all of them will outshadow Bieber, but okay. But outside of the songwriter's credit from LA Laker Javal McGee of all people, it's a wash, it really is. Post Malone sounds fine enough on production that's not far removed from Stoney, but then we got Clever's horrible delivery in his verse. Kalani will then step up, only for Quavo and Travis Scott to phone in everything. And then there's Lil Dicky, who apparently replaced a version of Running Over that had Ski Mask the Slump God on it. I somehow have the feeling that would have been a lot more interesting and better. Now, I call this all playlist fodder, but let's be real. The only reason this is gonna move units at all is Justin Bieber's name.
Wayne. You give it to anyone else, you would call this a turd. Solid 3 out of 10, no recommendation, not even for the fans, and honestly, I can see this being forgotten in record time.
Next up from Phantogram, Ceremony. Okay, maybe it's just me, but I gotta say it at this point. Phantogram are now 4 albums in, and they seem to be actually getting worse. And when it's been 4 years between albums, I stopped making excuses. Now granted, I don't think any of their albums have been great per se, but at this point we're a decade in, and there's no strong crossover single to save or redeem this mess, which throws skittering trap elements and programmed percussion against increasingly claustrophobic, squonking synths that are trying to evoke a lot of fractured grandeur, a lot of that this week, and a lot of samples that don't match with anything due to muddy and inconsistent fidelities, and overmixed guitar fragments fighting within the murk for the faint hope of a hook might materialize that Sarah Barthel's singing might struggle free, and then the desperate prayer that Josh Carter's voice does not. What's frustrating is that in this compressed mono-genre pile-up where the edges are as much of the point was increasingly played out 3 years ago, and here it still can't bother to coalesce around a solid low-end groove. It's the same issue as 3. Phantogram albums have the tonal weight and swell to really explode or surge, but they're missing the foundation and the blended focus to do so. That's before we get to the atonal mess of songs across the midsection that might be trying for more apocalyptic atmosphere, but are nowhere near sharp enough to deliver it. Now this is where I would hope the writing would step up as it did on 3, and you know what, let me give the duo too much credit and say that if they're trying to imply an increasingly dystopian world, the ceremonies and social norms, they'll fracture and become fragile, and that can lead to drama and human relationships or extreme behavior. Intriguing idea, but it's a thin concept at best to stretch over a lot of bad production, and the lyrical ideas are really given the thought or innovative wordplay to make them more unique and potent, especially given the specter of Sarah Barthel's sister's death that lingers over a few songs that tonally hit some flat notes. That's where we get the thudding, splatter painting writing of cuts like Gaunt Kids that, again, think playing word association passes for death. In other words, I'm sorry, even with no expectations, this is a real disappointment. 4 out of 10, not good. And finally, from Lil Uzi Vert, Eternal Atake.
I stay with the baddest, I'm counting cabbage while making my lady come.
This album actually got added to my schedule last time it was open. In 2018. Same patron who did it too, so thanks for your patience. But it got me thinking about Lil Uzi Vert's baffling and consistent popularity, so I went back and re-listened to the entire bloated mess that is Love Is Rage 2, and I think I get the appeal. I mean, at its best, the comparison that came to mind the most was Playboi Carti. Utterly empty, sugary trap bangers with way more style than substance, and it's basically a crapshoot if the song clicked due to his utter inability to maintain a consistent tone in delivery or content. That's arguably the reason why EXO Tour Life has never really worked for me, because while it is a pitch-black moment of existential horror in the party in the same vein that Just Dance by Lady Gaga is, it never fully nails that balance and tone. It's also a formula that's not built to last, so when Eternal Atake fell into development hell, I never expected it to get released, especially when the singles just kept flopping. But here we are, and you know, I'd probably sound a lot more impressed if Uzi's content or sound had really evolved significantly beyond piling on the spacey synths and the thinnest possible alien abduction framing device against your standard, although bizarrely underweight trap percussion. But those are really token changes for a project that in the streaming economy, other artists would churn out within 6 months. And when you open up your album with a cut that might as well be a Future ripoff, and then spend your album delivering Lil Wayne riffs with less wordplay and more brand names, I'm just left consistently underwhelmed. As for the album proper, ends with P2, a flagrant attempt to remix the success of EXO Tour Life and highlight just how empty of new ideas this album really is. And since this album doesn't have much variation in concept or really the sound, all the excess and flash just gets really one-dimensional really fast. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. Look at Lil Jon or Andrew WK. It's both shallow music, it's one-dimensional
one-dimensional, but the common lesson that none of these acts learned is that you need brevity to provide some focus, ergo this should have been a half hour at most, and it's not like Lil Uzi Vert is a great rapper to even be the best at this one thing. He slides off the beat, his flows are unoriginal, his vocal inflections are really flat and overexposed in the mix. He's not really a likable presence given his attitudes towards everyone, especially women, not even touching the lines about turning gay girls straight on a song right after Sid guest starred, and as there is so many embarrassing lines. Alright, look, he really is the definition of someone who has kept a lot of cultural longevity, more on scarcity of his product and image rather than the actual content. And maybe I'm just not enough of a hype beast to get on board, but yeah, sorry. I ain't impressed by this. 4 out of 10 for the fans, and I know there's a lot of them, not for me. Next up from Body Count, Carnivore. Okay, let's keep this real. The question is less whether or not this album is any good, and more, was Body Count ever any good? For those of you who aren't aware, this was a thrash metal hip-hop side project by Ice-T, where he doesn't really rap that much, instead delivering hyperbolic and ultra-violent stories with the belief that as a parody, they would both speak truth to power, but also inspire black kids to stay away from that sort of life. Now, the problem with this sort of parody is that hip-hop rapidly hit this level of excess anyway, and Ice-T was really ham-fisted with his messaging. This sort of project and genre fusion required tact that he didn't really have, so previous Body Count albums have not only aged really badly, but can also default to glorification as much as it was sending a message. Couple that with just better rap metal that's been released throughout the decades, and Carnivore feels like a real struggle to catch up. Now, that's not terrible. It doesn't sound as shoddily produced as previous Body Count albums, and Ice-T has always been a powerful frontman, and if you can break free of the cognitive dissonance of long-running Law & Order SVU star Ice-T rapping about police violence, lyrically, the album feels a little more grounded until we default back to the same hyper-masculine, violent posturing. And this feels all the more jarring opposite the two tribute songs, one being a middling cover of Ace of Spades, and the other a tribute to the late Nipsey Hussle, featuring Amy Lee of Evanescence, and it's as tonally weird as you would expect. And the frustrating thing is that even if you're accepting this on the most basic level and concept, it's just not even very good metal. The grooves are sloppily defined in the bass, the riffing gets tedious, there's barely any attempt at atmosphere, more than a few songs are lacking momentum, and for as developed as some of the drum lines can be, they don't often synchronize all that well with the rhythm section, which leads to some really messy solos. But overall, let's be real, this has always been a novelty side project of which I'm not sure you could have ever taken that seriously, and in 2020, there's not much worth discussing. 4 out of 10, I'd move on. Next up from Conan Gray, Kid Krow. This is probably the most requested album I've gotten across social media in recent memory, and I'll admit to being a little shocked by that. For those of you who don't know, he was a vlogger, but also a pretty serious musician in his own right. He's opened for Panic at the Disco, he's built a following and a pretty rabid fan base, so I was hoping this would be a short but interesting debut, and look, I'm not at all that impressed. What it reminds me of is a weird mishmash of 80s inspired and quasi-theatrical Gen Z pop, some of Billie Eilish's cadences and hushed delivery, and a lingering whiff of the fuckboy rap, minus the actual rapping. Now, part of this is just an immediate distaste for this guy's voice, a very willowy timbre that just doesn't have much intensity, made all the more blatant when he's expected to sell more loud, dramatic moments, and he's mixed in with a filter in a way to disguise how he really can't do it. But it also comes to some of the content. He's not really an active participant in most of his stories, and when he is, he's not all that likable. There's a petulance that creeps through that just sets my teeth on edge. His responses to exes potentially spreading lies about him or acting crazy, he takes the high ground, and then he doubles down on the very same pettiness. And when you've got an album with so much of that, the sourness not conveyed well, it becomes a big problem. It's not the petty melodrama in and of itself, but how it's delivered for me. And while I've got issues with the production too, for the bedroom pop formula, it's pretty far from subtle or textured, while still having a lot of sloppy and cheap sounding percussion, and the bass presence is really
really inconsistent. By the time we get to the song Affluenza, though, where the framing is less calling out the bullshit of that term and more playing sympathetic to the overprivileged rich Hollywood kids, no, I'm tapping out hard. Little League song was kind of cute, though. This is a 4 out of 10. Can't recommend it. From Sam Hunt, Southside.
Hard to forget.
I already went on about this album for over 20 minutes, full of aghast horror, disgust, and lamentation. It'll likely be the worst album that'll be released this year, if we can even call this extended debasement of entitlement a release. In a just world, every executive at MCA Nashville would be fired on the spot for criminal mismanagement. In the meantime, it's a 1 out of 10, and the sort of lazy atrocity that isn't even worth this level of attention. Next up, from Dryjacket, Going Out of Business. I'll be blunt, probably should have vetoed this album, but I'm including it on the schedule in order to make a point. Just because there's a genre or subgenre or trend within a genre that I might have a preference towards does not mean I'm gonna like everything I hear within it. Case in point, Dryjacket, who on their sophomore album decided their way of making their fusion of Midwestern emo and pop punk was for getting anything close to an interesting hook, getting lead singers with no edge and a distinctly sanitized mid-2000s pop punk voice, and injecting a bunch of fidgety math rock noodling and trumpets into the verses instead of competent drum mixing or a decent groove. I can't even put it in the American football camp of being more atmospheric and thoughtful because there's no attempt to create an atmosphere. And it's genuinely alarming how tepid and boring it all is, sounding more like the act in this genre that might actually get the occasional commercial because it is so anonymous. Now, this would be where I would go to the writing to find something to redeem them, and yet somehow it made me like them even less. I get trying to juxtapose cheery, upbeat melodies and clean, bouncy production with a lot of sullen introspection, underweight anxiety, curdled anger, and at one point an outright suicide wish. I mean, it's trying to make an obvious point about how people disguise their true angst in normal suburbia. But where the best of the emo revival is populist, or at least trying to see beyond the bleak future, there's this mean-spirited pettiness to a lot of these tracks that's far less likable and far more dissonant with any sense of tone. So somehow you wind up with the worst of both worlds. Emo that will wallow in stasis and insufferability, backed up by the sort of anonymous but chipper tones that don't have the hooks nor texture to make it all that interesting. In other words, it's not good. Extremely late 4 out of 10, and frankly, I'm being generous. And finally, from DaBaby, Blame It On Baby. I made my bitch talk to me when we fuck out back. Big rocks on my wrist, I'm bust. Alright, let's keep this short. I understand why DaBaby rushed to drop a new album now. Serve the fan base with the knowledge he can't really compete with the big releases likely delayed until later this year. Even without a major single push, I get it. But it's also the textbook example of a rush job that makes DaBaby's impressive charisma bleed away into some really weak singing and a flow and content that he struggles to switch up. And when you have production this slapdash and undercooked, the lead and bass mixing and the lack of strong melody has been an issue his entire run, and somehow it's even worse here. But it smacks of bad management that told him that he needed to release something now, and instead of actually refining those variations in his delivery and flow, then deliver throwaway mixtape quality, which also applies to his bars in every guest appearance. It's a bad sign where his sex references alongside taking your girl are repeatedly just disgusting, and there's very little of the same flair and wit that made previous projects have more character. And even when you might think there are moments where he seems like he's gonna show more vulnerability, it's nearly always a bait and switch, which really cheapens any attempt at real emotion. The closest we get is Rockstar, where he tries to croon rap opposite Roddy Ricch to his daughter about his Walmart shooting issue, but even Roddy's not staying on topic or matching the attempted mood. And outside of Jump with Youngboy Never Broke Again for just braggadocious gunplay that I kinda got into, and a remake of Ashanti's Baby on Nasty with Megan Thee Stallion, which is a song I didn't even like in 2002, that's about the best it gets. Look, I still think DaBaby has a lot of potential, but this was rushed, it was a bad idea, it reflects very questionable management and production, and none of it speaks to a progression so much as a backslide. So yeah, DaBaby, I'm blaming this on you, because it's not good. 4 out of 10, I would say the fans would like it, but I'd probably say skip it.
Next up from AWOLNATION, Angel Miners and the Lightning Riders. This is the third AWOLNATION album I've reviewed, and at this point I'm a little at a loss why the material isn't sticking with me whatsoever. It's bombastic, it careens across styles, it usually winds up a total mess. Frontman Aaron Bruno is clearly trying to make something stick, and yet when you are 4 albums in and I can barely recall a melody or an interesting turn of phrase from those albums outside of Sail, that's a big problem. A band that's trying so hard to sound so impactful should not sound this forgettable. And it's not just one thing here either. The more obvious culprit seems to be production, where whenever you would expect those revving anthemic guitars to really kick up, they're always a little bit too far back in the mix, and pairing with painfully underweight bass and drum patterns don't help. Then there's Aaron Bruno himself, who has some dynamic personality as a singer, but never seems to grasp how to accentuate it all that well. And given that he's produced all the AWOLNATION albums in-house, you can probably blame him for how the band is consistently stuck 2 years behind the times, with no real production crunch or flavor. That's the other glaring flaw. For as much as the band, especially here, tries to emphasize their wild, radical, renegade credentials in their lyrics, when of course they're not trying to subvert them to utterly neuter any sense of power or bombast or atmosphere, which when you're writing a song about the California wildfires that destroyed your home studio, you'd think you'd bring some sense of intensity, but well, I would say they were devoured by the Imagine Dragon, but that's not even a thing anymore, and when they were doing that sound originally, back at the beginning of the decade, they were okay at it. What's all the more emblematic of is the same thing that's happened to Purity Ring. They might have been at the forefront of the sound initially, but then that sound got beaten into the ground, and compositionally, they could just never keep up as their identity became less distinct. So much so that when they collaborated with Rivers Cuomo on Pacific Coast Highway in the movies, it sounds like a Pacific Daydream era Weezer song, and a pretty bad one. Alright, look, maybe you can frame this as a back-to-basics approach as they're now on a new label, but the production and compositions are toothless. This mess has long stopped being interesting, the sequencing is incredibly sloppy, and again, a project trying this hard to be anthemic, it should never be this boring. 4 out of 10, no recommendation. And finally, from Future, High Off Life.
Popping new tags, it's 1/1. I got them chopsticks, ain't on the lunch.
Here's the great benefit of a series like this. I can give Future about as much time as he deserves. A borderline postscript at the end of this video, cause what is there even left to say? There's no surprises, there's no visceral intensity, there's very little in the way of an interesting tune or atmosphere, most of which is buried behind the omnipresent trap skitter, and when it does show up, somehow Future picks some of the most awkward tumbling cascades or plucking squonks imaginable, and while I'd personally argue Future's been on autopilot the past couple of projects, here it's just obvious and really unflattering. How in the nine hells is the percussion mixing getting worse with every separate album to sound even more flat and cheap, which doesn't match any of the opulence or brand names that he continues to brag about? I mean, the best thing I can say about this is that there's a couple guest appearances that sound okay. The Young Boy Never Broke Again interplay led to a decent hook, and you know what, for as stupid as All Bad is with Lil Uzi Vert, it's got energy, but outside of that, well, give me Up the River with its Rod Wave-esque piano line, which along with last name shows exactly how much he's jacking from that sound. And, I don't know, Posted with Demons for pure nihilistic trashiness. It's misogynist, but it kind of plays into it. Pitch the rest. Light 4 out of 10. You will forget this came out this year. Probably forget this came out this month, much like the last time. Next up, from Off-Road Minivan, Swan Dive. So this has been on my schedule for a few weeks, mostly because the lyrics weren't published anywhere until pretty recently, but also because if patrons request the emo side projects of underwhelming metalcore bands like Fit for a King, there's just not going to be much that'll grab my interest. Now, I heard some listeners find this different because the frontman is going for an early 2000s post-grunge huskiness with a real bad head cold that doesn't really match the visceral presence of other acts, or indeed convey much emotional personality at all, but that's because the entire album screams of an established and polished, more radio act, making a pivot toward this now popular subgenre in rock, and losing a fair amount of intensity along the way. Hell, even a lot of the emo that got popular in the early 2000s had more punch than this. Now, that's not saying that there aren't advantages coming from this angle. If you're not punks just coming up, you probably know how to structure a cohesive song or a strong hook, or at least have better odds in terms of production. And even if there are moments where the band goes kinda back to some metalcore roots and it doesn't match with anything, there's gotta be a little more polish or punch here, right? Well, that's the thing when you wind up on Tooth and Nail. Between some messy cymbal mixing, some questionable elevation of the pitchier elements of our frontman's vocals, and some of the acoustics can sound really oddly canned, and then the guitars that increasingly slide towards grungy, down-tuned riffing, just winds up feeling both sour and really running together in terms of its overall tune. And if the production doesn't get there for you, the content certainly will. I've said before in talking about emo that if you're gonna hit rock bottom, maybe find some sort of lyrical flair or a glimmer of hope or some larger societal commentary, whereas this act not only doubles down on the suicide songs, most of them are framed as sullen responses to breakups or lost love, with enough self-awareness that it's a guilt trip, but not enough to actually stop it. And that's where all the pseudo-religious faux martyr angle slides in and just becomes really unpleasant. In other words, yeah, it's boring as tar, and when it's not, it's miserable. And not in the good way. 4 out of 10, no recommendation. Next up from Lil Yachty, Lil Boat 3.
I'm around till the beat is over. Tushing up back, same price my mink sofa. And I move like the King Cobra. Slamming in my dog, I didn't have to think it over. This little bitch, I'ma bend her over. After I'm done, call the gang, I'ma send her over.
Let's keep this quick. I think it's pretty obvious that Lil Yachty's time in the mainstream has faded fast. He was somewhat right in that his brand has eclipsed some of his actual impact, but outside of writing that he's done behind the scenes, his star has been eclipsed by artists that somehow show off even less variety and quality. And even then, with every project that he has targeting the mainstream, Yachty's sound has gotten less homegrown and melodic, and more of his oddball personality has fallen away to reveal a painfully limited, auto-tuned croon rapper with weak flows and haphazard wordplay. Now, this is his first solo project since dropping both Nothing to Prove and Lil Boat 2 in 2018, and Lil Boat 3 proves in spades over 19 songs, nearly an hour, that there wasn't anything worth missing here. The kooky melodies are often faded against increasingly sterile, cheap, and basic trap percussion, which somehow Yachty is still struggling to ride effectively in his increasingly flat and disaffected auto-tune flow. And midway through the album, a lot of the actual tune just evaporates or somehow gets even uglier. And outside of basic repetition, there's little in the way of distinctive melodic hooks, or even much coherence in structuring a vocal crescendo to build to a hook. It's very clear that most of this album is cobbled together from undercooked, underproduced fragments with little beyond utterly boring gunplay, brand names, and sex references that's only split up by the occasional punchline that isn't so much weird in an interesting way, but kinda corny in the same way that Big Shawn used to be. But even in terms of pure bangers, he gets handily outshone by most of the guests that show up, most obviously on TD, courtesy of Tierra Whack and Tyler the Creator, but even by Future, a song later. And that's not counting moments when Drake, DaBaby, and Young Thug show up. I mean, I'll give Lil Yachty credit that it's not as embarrassingly incompetent as he's been before, but that might honestly be worse, because there's pretty much nothing here that stuck with me as unique or innovative that I really cared about beyond mild disgust. And when I did care, it wasn't because of him. So yeah, this ain't good. Strong 3 out of 10, skip it. Finally, from the Black Eyed Peas, Translation. Do any of you remember those often token feeling Latin pop albums that get made whenever there's a Latin pop craze in the US? Okay, imagine the Black Eyed Peas made that album, except it's nearly an hour long and rooted in some of the most rote, sterile, and tuneless reggaeton you're ever gonna hear. I mean, if you're lucky enough to hear a decent instrumental melody, it comes from a sample or an interpolation forced through J. Ray Soul playing the mostly uncredited Fergie role. Seriously, Tanta Love as a solo joint for her, it's probably the best thing on the album, but otherwise you'll get nothing, or the same inert blaring synths you might find in a will.i.am solo venture, complete with grainy, clanking percussion that's got the sort of blown out sharpness that actively distracts from everything else in the song, which might be a good thing considering how the Black Eyed Peas use Spanish as a language, but it's got the clunky, faintly gross feeling of garnishing songs with words in order to force rhymes and bring some sort of flavor to their utterly formless party slogans, delivered with no passion or presence behind usually a healthy dollop of autotune. At least until the final songs on the album, where they run out of guest appearances and return to the dead-eyed flexing with no Spanish off the reggaeton, and somehow it sounds even more canned, like it was a gimmick. This is an album that's carried more by everyone who's not the Peas, and this leads you to haphazard results when you get a contribution from Shakira and she delivers her most disinterested hook and verse in her career, or how you give Becky G a synth crib from a PC Music reject, or how you flip You Can't Touch This from MC Hammer and you throw in a guest verse from Tyga of all people on your song that's all about Ricky Martin references. And look, the Black Eyed Peas, they've always made stupid music, but they're at their best when the stupidity somehow inverts and becomes part of their charm and gets fun. But that doesn't happen because the group doesn't lean into it. This is just weirdly dour and mechanical, which makes the last moment an acoustic pivot on the final song News Today so utterly wrong-headed. Because will.i.am then tries to address the pandemic and protests, conflates them, and then loops in references to conspiracy theories while they try to call out a certain POS in chief for his conspiracies. I mean, it's somehow worse than the remake of Where Is the Love from 2016. It's arguably one of the worst songs I've heard all year from a pretty atrocious album. In other words, I hope to God you didn't hear it. Strong 2 out of 10. Even then, feels like I'm being generous. Next up from Kevin Max, Radio Teknika.
Centuries. Human interaction, human trust, human intuition, human love. We were created to share.
Oh god, how do I even start with this? Alright, in the 90s there was a Christian rap rock group called DC Talk that's widely considered one of the most preeminent groups in the Christian subculture in that era, and when they got signed, they gradually moved to more pop rock. But then their frontman Kevin Max decided to go in a slightly weirder, slightly more secular direction when he went solo, which his Christian major label didn't get, and he's been somewhat indie ever since, minus a few reunions and other Christian rock collaborations. Now, I've described my problems with Christian music before. The more evangelical side can rub me the wrong way, and the production can sound really cheap and or sanitized, and throughout his back catalog, both issues are frequent and frustrating. But you know what I will say, his off-kilter and occasionally more thoughtful approach has made his material a bit more interesting to revisit, and he can write a good hook on occasion, like on a lot of 2015's Broken Temples. Although, if I'm being blunt, nothing that really blew my mind. Not helped by nearly all of his projects running really long. Now, in recent years, he's moved more towards an electronic synthwave palette with some very mixed results, because I'm not forgiving him for that awful cover of Love Will Tear Us Apart by Joy Division. But on this album, well, it's not synthwave, I can say that. Honestly, I kind of wish it was, because the best way I can describe this is as a blend of clunky, underproduced electronics and flat spoken word you would have heard in the more pretentious experimental dance projects that were dropping around the mid to late 90s, where if I wasn't certain that Kevin Max wasn't on drugs, I would ask him for all the acid. Now, this would be where I would come here and call this an outright disaster, because it certainly has the signs of it. It contains some of the most painfully dated drum machines and blending in a really flat and charmless way. There are some of the most poorly considered horns I have heard on a record in years. The pacing is absolutely terrible. There are dub and world music digressions that are about as cringeworthy as you can get. Kevin Max barely even sings, instead opting for this flat, passionless delivery, and more than a few 90s Bowie plagiarisms. And then when you think you can't expect more, voice actor Troy Baker delivers a nihilistic monologue that not only doesn't fit thematically on the project, but also cribs liberally from Heath Ledger's Joker. And to some degree, I think this might still be a disaster. For as much as this project is framed as a scattered musings through struggles with faith and what the Christian church in the United States has become, most of it circles back to some very bland, undercooked utopianism, and on the back half some weird self-loathing individualism that I found very telling. It's very 90s, pseudo-spiritual, slacker hipster in its outlook, and highlighting all the problems, but not particularly galvanized to do more than just, love man and dance and brood. And maybe that last one gives me something. Both Vampire and Becoming James Dean, they were fragments that were kind of okay, but this is a project that fails utterly to be political, conscious, or relevant, and I struggle to say that it's even absurd enough to be a so bad it's good disaster. It runs nearly an hour, and it gets really boring, vacillating, and kind of insufferable really fast. In other words, I went on a rant about a lot of things that pissed me off about Gen X a few weeks back on Twitter. I really shouldn't have bothered, because I can just point to this album and say, all of this. 3 out of 10, it sucks, and not even in the fun way. Next up, from Raleigh, Ritchie, Andy. I'm always a little bit skeptical on covering side projects as a rule, and even more so when they come from somebody who's already famous in another profession. Case in point, Raleigh Ritchie is the stage name for Jacob Anderson, who's most well known for his role on Game of Thrones. But what I often find with a lot of these projects is that they can feel kind of undercooked in their artistic identity because they're riding on a different wave of celebrity, and that was kind of the vibe I got from his 2016 debut, which I'd saw into an odd mix of pop R&B with smatterings of trap and UK hip-hop. I didn't get that much out of it. It had the weird feeling of pulling from so many other sources that its uniqueness kind of felt insubstantial. But, I don't know, maybe his follow-up would hit more? Well, unfortunately, not at all. In fact, I would argue Andy is considerably worse than his debut across the board, and we have to start in the composition and sound. The first thought that immediately came to my mind is, oh, this is what AJR would sound like if they were British, black, and discovered a bass frequency. But what it reminded me a lot more of is Bozzy's cheap-sounding percussion matched with a lot of wonky arrangements full of classical strings and horns. But you know what? Despite the fractured production, I remember liking Bozzy a lot more than a lot of people because despite it all, the songs were short and had just enough glistening hook in order to hold together. Raleigh Ritchie, meanwhile, is trying to carry the majority of these songs with a flat baritone in his lower register, which he just does not have the charisma nor presence in the mix to pull off. And yet, when you have songs like Squares, which proves he can sing in his middle register, they warp his voice all throughout the hook with these glassy, gummy effects that not only clash hideously with the arranged elements, but make all these songs feel really misshapen and lumpy and unflattering. Now, I thought maybe all that was the point. The album is very downbeat and depressed, a wallow in sullen angst and anxiety. Maybe all the terrible synth mixing, awkward sample choices, and out of nowhere pitch shifting, both in breakdowns and chipmunk vocals, it's intensifying the ugliness compared to a brighter, more classically happy world. And I can kind of argue some of that, but there's three main problems with that. The first, the mixing is almost distractingly ugly, and I'm left thinking the point could have been made just on the content and delivery versus maybe more of an elegant arrangement. Number two, it happens on the more straightforward songs that are not attempting the juxtaposition, especially the final two songs. And number three, you still have to buy into Ritchie as compelling. And from his monotonous delivery to a lot of the writing, for me, he's just not. For one, you get lines like, the hater inside is the Vader of shade, or let's be squares in a round world, but really that's just corny. The ugly side comes out in how he wishes he could have been part of the 27 Club, or all the sad boy wallow on the song of the same name, or how awkwardly performative so much of the writing feels, especially opposite this production where a lot of the intimacy is constantly undercut by all the strings and bombast. I get depression and looking inwards. My favorite album thus far in 2020 is emo, but there's not much in the way of detail or self-discovery beyond a lot of woozy self-loathing that's attempting to alienate the audience. And both SDFU and Shadow feel really undercooked in pushing back those demons. As a whole, I get the potency that comes with celebrity vulnerability, and with a very spare piece like Structure, I hear where this could have worked, but man, execution's dire. Light 4 out of 10. Can't recommend it. Next up from Will Wood, the Normal album.
Alright with you, and when we find out what's wrong with me, could you tell me how I'm right for you?
I'm gonna cover this at length to make a point surrounding a specific aesthetic in music that only works for me in extremely limited cases. The screwball, quasi-dark, vaudeville, highly theatrical, cabaret, or carnival-esque music, where the point is to be as super zany and manic until it tips into outright darkness. I'll be blunt, I get the appeal. I grew up in the mid-2000s, this was an aesthetic that was worked to death in pop rock and emo, but it's so rarely works for me these days because I can count on the number of albums where it clicks for me on one hand, often because it's trying to overcompensate for slapdash writing, going for cheap shock, or really bad production that can't nail the atmosphere, or how it can sound like shtick that's just not as witty or fun as it wants to be. And I specified aesthetic, not genre, because I've seen this more from pop to country to a lot more than I would like in metal, and why when we started listening to Will Wood, he had an uphill battle to win me over, even before I heard the Weird Al Yankovic-esque exaggerated manic delivery in his vocals. And I'll admit that while Self-ish was fine enough and occasionally had some decent lyrical moments, it still had enough of that vibe to test my patience, and thus I did not have high expectations for this. And here's the thing. I get it's an obvious satire. Obvious because deconstructing the repressed chipper plasticity of 50s culture has been done to death since the 70s, and if you're not into this aesthetic and stylism that I described, I'm not sure how much of this will resonate at all, but Will Wood is not just doing that, because I'm not sure layers of detached irony and nihilism can get away with how he throws himself into the trans-medicalist, trans-trender debate on I, Me, Myself, where he himself has described as a critique of problematic proponents co-opting the gender identity movement and spaces for those genuinely very deeply oppressed and abused. But then he ends the song by literally saying all identities are equally invalid, and it seems to me any real point seems missed. And then there's the entire midsection focusing on mental health, where by the end it just seems kind of incoherent. You don't want people to find identity within their mental illness, as you think that some people are shopping around for a diagnosis, but you also don't want them to find normality within pharmaceuticals because you've been taking the piss out of conformity the entire project with lines that come out like the things that make you special are the same things that make you strange, before we end on the most basic, well, we're all gonna die anyway, nihilistic sentiments, which kind of flies in the face of all of that subtext about not wanting people to falsely co-opt mental illness or gender identity if you're just gonna blow it all off anyway. And I'm not sure any of this fits well with the very manic performativity of this style, even if you're being subversive about it. Which is kind of a shame, because when you get to the compositions themselves, this might be Will Wood's most tolerable album, and that he'll occasionally slow down a little bit, use a slightly less exaggerated vocal tone, and provide a bit more balance across the album so it doesn't give me a splitting headache, at least not immediately. Now, granted, that forced Frankie Valli impression he keeps doing, which is followed by a gargling cackle on the opener, and his falsetto on the next two songs, especially when it's paired with touches of ska, and the entire mix has this very forced chintziness and strangely whitewashed lack of groove that's got the mastering of a pretty bad off-Broadway musical. Okay, look, the only songs I found tolerable was the warped lullaby of, well, Better Than the Alternative, which even still has some of the ugliest drum machines and ukulele I've heard in a while, and the piano work and the Spanish guitar on Black Box Warrior Occultra, it's manic, but not exploding immediately. By doing so, it can build a bit of atmosphere until the horns drop in and the spoken word kills any sort of momentum. That's probably my biggest problem with this album beyond all the confused nihilism. There's so much obvious flop sweat in the overwritten lyrics and especially the delivery that I can't appreciate any of the impressive playing or any attempt at atmosphere. And the more I grasp what this was actually doing, Yeah, the less I liked it. In other words, I like 4 out of 10 because I know this sound works for some people, I get the appeal, but the content and delivery means I never want to touch this again. Not at all fun. Next. Next up from Stand Atlantic, Pink Elephant. So it's a bad sign when the most I remember about your pop punk act is that your front woman vaguely sounds like one of those super polished teenage boys that fronted the pop punk wave in the mid 2000s, and that your sound is just as forgettable coming from that era. I said this back in my Neck Deep review a few weeks ago, but acts like this are completely tedious for me to review, because not only did I grow up with the genuine article, I actually did grow up, whereas many of these bands feel perpetually adolescent and rarely have the distinctive hooks or punch or writing to really stand out, so they come across as kind of derivative. And Stand Atlantic is absolutely in that pile. I found their debut utterly interchangeable, and now on their sophomore album, well, it's got a bit more personality, but mostly through choices I find really frustrating. I'd say it reminds me a little of Water Parks and some of their poppier elements, but Water Parks could at least craft a dynamic or magnetic hook, whereas Stand Atlantic sound like they cribbed a lot of their synth mixing and their vocal compression from the late 2000s, and no, that is not a compliment. The vocal mixing is by far the worst part of this album. And what's crazy is that you would think by going so often to chunky riffs and sharper percussion, they even sneak in a trap hi-hat onto Silken Satin, that they would have a more defined low-end bass line or bass groove, but too many of these songs wind up sounding really stiff and overblown, without any sort of broader melodic contrast or development to really drive a strong crescendo, or even help individual songs stand out with better hooks, which is what you want in pop punk. Honestly, I kind of feel bad for frontwoman Bonnie Fraser trying to holler through all this, but truth be told, she's not exactly a particularly dynamic performer herself, which means that all amidst all the teenage angst, there's not much in the way of cutting or distinctive detail that sticks with me, and very little the bouncy major chord pop punk that matches it. It leads to a project that is full force way too often, but somehow missing any sort of impact, either thanks to a lacking low end, a singer that's clawing through a lot of vocal overproduction, ugly synths that add nothing, and writing that does not match any of the tone, and it leads to a mess. 4 out of 10, can't recommend. Next up from Lil Keed, Trapped on Cleveland 3.
You were trying to stick around, you was in my home. Heard you was up, but I don't want no friend, you call my phone.
I'm honestly surprised I don't get more trap mixtapes that show up on my schedule. I mean, I can repeat a lot of what I would normally say about one to another week after week, especially on Billboard Breakdown, and you wouldn't miss much. And Lil Keed is sadly a prime example of it. I've been vaguely aware of this guy for a bit through his ties to Young Thug's label and 300, but I haven't had anything to really say about him because I haven't heard what made him all that distinctive or interesting in terms of his flow or his sound. And on this hour-long mixtape as studio album, we get pretty much all the same. What's frustrating is that he imitates a lot of Young Thug's more frustrating elements, a lot of empty flexing and brand name porn that's passing off as content, a lot of forced rhymes, the swampy bass mixing against some bleeping synths, the washed out guitars, and the very thin trap drum machines, not nearly enough real ideas to sustain a stream-trolling 19-song album. But he also has few of the parts that make Young Thug distinctive, like the organic yowls and the completely over-the-top subject matter. Hell, when he tries to make some of his sex rhymes over the top, he just gets kind of juvenile. Or really just kind of gross. And while I'm sure the audience won't care if it bangs hard enough, how many distinctive hooks are we actually getting here, in comparison with a newer crop of artists like Roddy Ricch, who will switch up his flow a lot more often, or even Lil Baby, who is trying to get more mature? So this would be where I would go to the guest appearances, or just find the scattered bangers that somehow work. Well, outside of Young Thug and Gunna sounding like they'd rather be anywhere else, and I can't blame them, and Lil Baby once again sleepwalking through his verse. I actually think the Travis Scott of all people kind of snapped on the Wavy remix that's included, and Future did what he needed to on Zaza. And outside of that, Cold World is okay off of some of the howling guitars. I think the closer here has a pretty solid humid vibe with some of the more textured percussion. And I'll say this, the thicker cushion of synth behind Heartbreaker, it's a more distinctive and potent trap banger than frankly anything Lil Keed has ever made. Maybe it's a little bit more basic in the content, but it's got personality and color in the production. It actually stands out. The rest though, look, you've heard more than a few albums like this over the past 5 years. This does not stand out. It's not good even to boot. So, light 4 to 10, move on. Next up from Glass Animals, Dreamland.
Slipping through dreamland like a torrent, pulling down pine trees deep in your head.
I remember there being so much hype around Glass Animals back when I was getting requests for them in 2016. They were perceived as having a unique sound and vibe. This dank, quasi-voyeuristic tone overladen with detail and psychedelic distortion. But really going back to How to Be a Human Being 4 years later, not only does it not feel as weird or kooky thanks to a sonic palette that stripped away a lot of the atmosphere of their debut, but also because there's an odd hollowness to a lot of their approach that just does not stick for me. A lot of deflection in highlighting the unkempt weirdness of humanity around them, but not much in the way of commentary or punch beyond very surface level reflections, which I'll say it, artists like Ariel Pink just do better at this point. But now on Dreamland, well, it's a lot of the same trick as last time, but somehow I like it significantly less now that he's set his own target on his own millennial nostalgia. Now, let me stress, this guy's about my age, and there is some overlap when it comes to late 90s, early 2000s nostalgia, going back to your childhood with adult eyes and realizing the plastic sheen of it all was not all that it was cracked up to be. Rina Sawayama exposed some of this on her debut this year, and it was great. The problem is that frontman Dave Bailey gets to all the cultural detritus, but very little of the insight. Again! If anything, it's worse this time around because his husky Tom York with the vocal pry approach, it feels gummy and way too close in the mix. Not helped by all the vocal filters, which just sound really tinny and gross. And the sound is this predominantly Californicated psychedelic texture left over from Kevin Parker and a blend of hip-hop and trap beats. I wish I was kidding on that part, but hell, even Denzel Curry shows up on Tokyo Drifting, and he's easily the most dynamic part of the entire album, even if he really cannot save that song. Look, my problem is that this is the exact sort of project to make passing commentary on getting mired in nostalgia or trying way too hard to be cool, but then it's just gonna go do it all anyway, and the motivations for it feel flimsy as all hell. I'd argue the biggest thing that separates his kitschy over-reliance on references from what AJR and Owl City got crucified for was going for the humid, festival-ready mono-genre, and yet if you don't care about lyrics, I could maybe see that being enough. But what's frustrating is that amidst all the undercooked and frequently asinine writing, and some of the questionable vocals, or how completely stupid Melon in the Coconut is, there are some decent grooves and slightly more grounded human scenes, especially on the back half of the album, with cuts like It's Also Incredibly Loud, even if that song doesn't live up to its title. I just wish there had been a consistent focus there rather than all the goopy psychedelia that just feels really derivative and tedious. And I can't help but hear a really ugly twinge for a guy to try to do the ironic hip-hop nod in 2020, and doing it so often that one of the better songs here, Your Love Deja Vu, owes a lot to early Justin Timberlake. Glad we woke up from that dream. Probably should leave this dream behind as well. For me, it's a strong 3 out of 10. Honestly, it's kind of generous. Next up from blackbear, everything means nothing.
And this crippling depression, I thought I learned my lesson.
I'm gonna be very mercenary here and only include this to get the traffic, because blackbear is not worth much in the way of thought or deeper consideration, and because a lot of my problems with him are actually pretty straightforward, because it's not because he's an asshole, or overprivileged, or unbearably shallow, or shamelessly derivative in terms of the guitar accent and mono-genre trends he's riding. No, all these in isolation, or even together, they could potentially make for good music. I'm open to that possibility. No, it's all this fused in aggregate, along with the fact that blackbear just cannot make it interesting. If anything, he acts as a presence that counters all the strengths behind these elements of his persona. If he's trying to be an unrepentant asshole, he is an utterly vacuous presence on the microphone with no power, and there's a sterility to his sound that adds no flair or color to it, nor any sort of complexity or insight as to why he might act more like this. He's a Californicated rich white boy, but he can't tap into either the decadence or the blissed out vibes or provide any sort of potent commentary on it, so it's shallow as sin, but it's rarely ever fun in being shallow, which is why him being so derivative is such a huge problem. Even if you want to revel in all the heights of the ugliness, there are a slew of fuckboy rappers who have already eclipsed what he's doing. His formula is far from unique here. It's also why Hot Girl Bummer, paradoxically, might be one of the better and worst songs on the album. It at least is a trashy hook, and it's flagrant cribbing from a meme behind Megan Thee Stallion, and if you kind of squint at it, there might be some sort of intoxicating acid to his misogyny that you might want to indulge at your worst. I get why this has an audience, until you realize that that's all it is, and you wish that Megan, or indeed any of the beautiful women that befuddle blackbear, would just pimp slap him. The ideal word to describe this album is pitiful, suffering the cardinal sin of bad nihilistic art in that it's too vacant and boring to say anything, can't even try to describe the deeper pain he apparently feels. There's a trio of songs on this album that are apparently tied to his pancreatitis, and you would never know that, and it's actively anti-fun in its lack of infectious populism. It doesn't plumb the depths of incomprehensible self-righteous wrongness that Sam Hunt did earlier this year, but that's also more because this project can't even try to fail that hard. When Loaf is more of an interesting presence on your album, and you have a song called Why Are Girls, seemingly confused at their abstract concept and then everything they do, no, blackbear, you struck out again. Strong 2 out of 10, of course you don't want to hear it, but I'll be honest, it's not even interesting enough to be worth the hate listen. Move on. Next up, from Lil Revive, Grim Peaks 2.
This life's where I'm always climbing, lost in my head, and I see my prayers. Sometimes I'm not scared to say goodbye.
Okay, this is like the third or fourth time I've talked about Josh A in some capacity. I reviewed a few songs of his on IG at Spectrum Pulse Beat the Rush, but this project under the name Lil Revive, which he describes as a side venture, almost the first tape were just Josh A rejects. And I have no idea why Josh A is convinced that he's got nearly enough personality or tightness as a wordsmith to pull off a side venture, especially as he's still an incredibly underwhelming presence on generic trap instrumentals that's trying to be marginally spooky. I mean, you put this opposite a Clipping album, especially in some of the experimentations that they had with horrorcore last year, and it gets blown out of the water. So alright, while we wait until Clipping's next project in a month or two to finish the job, here's Josh A, I mean Lil Revive, with the second Grim Peaks project that barely only clocks over 15 minutes, and it took me even less time to get sick of it. Even if we throw the thinnest of pretensions towards horrorcore out the window, which you probably should do, this is the definition of bland trend chasing. Sterile trap beats that cannot sell any sort of atmosphere or intensity, flows and delivery that are bargain barrel within emo rap right now, and both delivery and content that cannot stand out. It really feels like it's cribbing wholesale from what Lil Peep used to do, but taking less chances across the board and with worse hooks. And it makes some sort of morose content feel like undercooked whinging. Hell, he's proven as Josh A, he can bring a little bit more detail into his angst and storytelling, but here we're stuck with a lot of vague platitudes. And without any hooks or any sort of dynamic flair, it's just derivative as all hell, not helped by the few passes he makes at his haters coming with beating them on streams, or the utterly tired, I made all this money and I want you to know it, but I'm still sad and stuff, and so feel sorry for me. Look, it's just petulant, and without flair, it feels really whiny, and when it comes to the suicidal elements, it feels incredibly forced and kind of a little insensitive. I mean, emo rap has already moved on from this sound and approach. It might have been interesting 4 or 5 years ago, but it's not now. Strong 3 out of 10, skip it. Next up from Sprain is Lost Through Collision. You know, this is one of those cases where I have no idea why anyone wants me to cover this. I've made it no secret that I don't have a lot of luck with doom metal or material that defaults to the slower, more ponderous side of music. So when you give me a debut album from LA slowcore act Sprain, it was a choice I questioned, especially as it's one of those genres in which I don't really have the deepest familiarity, and I've struggled to like a lot of what I've heard. And thus with this, well, for one, his band is embracing elements of post-hardcore as well, and by that I mean the ragged whiplash, distorted guitars, a blend of inaudible shouting, and some unsupported clean vocals that I will call average at best, and a near total lack of groove or consistent hooks or even interesting tune. What's frustrating here is that if Sprain was doing cool or unique things with the guitar textures or the distortion that they will just elongate every single song with, maybe bring forth some sort of melody along the way, I might be able to get into more of the atmosphere, but as it is, when your 15-minute song is mostly squeaking guitar feedback and some very spare drum hits that constantly seem to be on the cusp of just breaking apart, the vibe does not really coalesce for me. Now, there are songs here that are a bit more developed, in that they hammer a lot of the same ugly chords or progressions on repeat, or get some weirdly underweight tones on the bog-standard anti-religion worship house, but at least on a cut like My Way Out, there's a bit more spare moodiness to work with. Probably the best song here. Unfortunately, this is where we have to go to the content, and once you get past the oddly misanthropic slant, which seems to be from an exhausted doctor's perspective on their patients, you know, I can see why that'd be relevant in 2020. The entire album will then plummet into rampant depressive nihilism, and it becomes a real wallow very fast. In other words, a sour listening experience becomes even more so. And I guess if that's your thing, maybe I can applaud the miserable consistency, but it was not something I wanted to revisit at all. It just became a bit of a chore. Strong 4 to 10, emphatically not for me. But if this is your genre, you might find something in this. Just saying. Next up from Bad Lad, Lunatic. So this was an album that dropped about 6 months ago that one of my patrons requested, suggesting he was in a similar lane to Ghostmane, maybe even being better, a super aggro, SoundCloud-inspired hardcore rap act calling himself a rage act hailing from the UK. Suffice to say, I was a fair bit less impressed, because across the board, the closer analog is probably 6ix9ine, minus the gang connections and the sexual assault charges, but with considerably worse mixing. See, there's a difference between ugh, this sounds gross, and ugh, this sounds gross and amateurish as all hell. And on Bad Lad's first 2 albums, the bass and vocal layering was literally so bad, I couldn't even take his howling obnoxiousness all that seriously, let alone think it was scary or intimidating. But alright, fine, 3 albums in, maybe there's something here. My god, I tried with this. It's not good whatsoever. And I'm starting with the production. Again, if you have someone with as much nasal, howling, in-your-face presence as Bad Lad, giving him trap acoustic guitars and a smattering of blaring synths and terrible percussion mixing, just makes him sound utterly ridiculous without more behind him, no matter how many vocal filters you're dropping in. He's trying to be this huge, mugging presence, but the blown-out vocal blending opposite the clunky bass bass is again so bad, so amateurish, that it kills the atmosphere in the crib. And that's before he tries to force some sung vocals as a bad Trippie Redd imitation, or some clunky auto-tune, and it just sounds laughable in this swamped out mix. For God's sake, he can't even keep the volume mix consistent between tracks. That's how Bush League this sounds. Now, that's not saying there isn't a place for this sort of sound or approach, but if you can't wrangle good hooks or emphasize your assets as a villainous shithead effectively, that's a problem. And again, it's an issue on the songs where he tries to rap instead of scream. Even in a UK hip-hop mold, he references a bunch of UK colloquialisms and pop culture, and it really sounds goofy as all hell. And as an MC, a lot of his subject matter, his very basic material of getting fucked up so he could go shooting and fucking people, it isn't all that creative or all that distinctive. The one passable balance of enraged angst with rap metal aggro swagger probably was Pain, for as much death metal as it tried to dial into, but it's also one of the few songs that sounds competently mixed. And even with the horrible mixing, I think Used to Be as a closer kind of worked better than I thought it would. But as a whole, yeah, no. This is the sort of edgelord shit I don't find remotely intimidating or impressive or punchy, and Bad Lad can be excruciatingly annoying and one-dimensional, but when your production is this bad, you're not even giving yourself a chance to succeed here, even on his own terms. So, no, this is terrible. Strong 2 out of 10, not at all recommended. Next up from Killer Be Killed, Reluctant Hero. Okay, look, I've talked about my reticence to cover side projects on this series, and that tends to extend to supergroups as well, although I do tend to be a little more tolerant because sometimes you do strike gold mashing together some distinctive facets of different acts. So, okay, you take the frontman of Sepultura and Soulfly, add a singer from Dillinger Escape Plan, the bassist of Mastodon, and the drummer of Converge, and alright, what do you get with this? Well, honestly, kind of all over the place. You would normally hope for this sort of fresh synthesis. 3 of the members will sing or growl or scream, and sonically the band will careen from chunky but mainstream accessible groove metal, a little more thrash than I'd personally prefer, and a smattering of metalcore, because of course there is. And yet, that debut album 6 years ago, it felt a lot less interesting than it should be. Well, it took this long to follow it up, and I'm still not really on board with it. For one, that might be one of the most confusingly mic'd drum kits I have heard in a while. Flimsy cymbals, a kick drum with some questionable punch, and one of the flattest snares I think I've ever heard, which doesn't really help the open question where the hell most of the bass lines are in order to supplement the rhythm guitar. Seriously, they want to call themselves groove metal with this, rather than something that's more of an awkward fusion of thrash and metalcore and maybe with some progressive elements? And I think some of this is ultimately a production issue, because the playing is there. It's certainly complex and developed, even as the guitars will form a wall of thrash chugging, but some of that might just be a factor of how you can clearly tell the songs will just whipsaw between contrasting styles of all the artists involved and all of their unique voices, often before they can develop a strong hook or a build-up, and usually with no proper transitions. Like their debut, it can lead to songs that can feel really awkwardly jerky and lacking a lot of internal direction, which I might put some of it down to their prog tendencies or a lot of Dillinger Escape Plan worship, where they add in some weirdly oily layering that might have atmosphere if I felt that any of these hooks stuck the landing. And you know what, it's not like any of these singers have much in the way of natural chemistry or complimenting of each other, or if the lyrics felt like anything beyond painfully rote aggro posturing and sloganeering that can feel just as generic. I want to say Left of Center tried to get political, but good luck figuring out the punch that actually landed here, even if it might be the best song on the album. I don't know, it's bizarre. A project this jumbled in its composition should not feel this tedious and lacking dimension without the hooks to even really stick for the mainstream rock and metal radio. And given that I'm already ambivalent to those timbres at best, this works with me even less here. So strong 4 out of 10, it likely serves a different audience, maybe more for the Dillinger Escape Plan crowd, but no, didn't work for me at all. Let's move on. From Shawn Mendes, Wonder.
So I actually already reviewed this album at length. Many people say it's one of the most positive, negative reviews I've ever made. But to boil it down, it's a scattershot, underwhelming, frequently frustrating failure. But it's the first time Shawn Mendes has made the sort of daring artistic pivot that makes me want to hear where he's gonna go next. In other words, 4 out of 10, but I still recommend you hear it because it's kind of bonkers and deserves at least a little bit more scrutiny. That's all. Next up from Grandson, Death of an Optimist.
So go and get your hands dirty. It isn't that much, but it's a good start. So go and get your hands dirty.
Okay, believe it or not, I really don't like calling an act a ripoff or derivative. I like finding the uniqueness in an artist, and it makes them more easy for me to follow or categorize. So when I come here and say Grandson sounds like 21 Pilots, but edgier, with more guitars, trap percussion, considerably more political, but weirdly less original and refined, I'm making that statement with the knowledge I just pissed off a lot of people. But it's really damn hard to avoid that impression when listening to this album feels like the worst sort of burned out doom scrolling, framed as a fight between Grandson's idealistic or optimistic impulses and a raging onslaught of nihilism, but one where he also kind of ensured nihilism stacked the deck because that will sell to irony-pilled Gen Z kids way better than hope and change, let alone any sort of real activism or systemic change. Indeed, in the first half of the project, he's trying to be the optimistic guy, but the political allusions are vague, skeptical, cliched, and half-baked at best. He doesn't want to move on from where he is, but he thinks he wants to lead, but most importantly, he doesn't want to be left behind. And while that might be representative of a lot of privileged people who are new to activism, I'm not sure that really adds if your subtext is, well, can we really fix anything anyway? So okay, I guess credit for knowing your target audience, but I immediately have a lot less patience for any veneer of self-awareness that he slathers onto the more nihilistic and considerably less tolerable back half of the album. There's a song here called We Did It, where he tries to get coy around how the last election really will not cause huge change because people only did the bare minimum, and not only does it feel excruciatingly ignorant and in bad taste of the current climate, especially for voters who were actively disenfranchised, and even how it doesn't acknowledge how systemic change does take long-term work and time, but it also ignores how incremental change can matter to a lot of people, especially when those people are marginalized by bad systems, which Grandson here certainly doesn't seem to be. Unfortunately, growing up in the 2000s, I feel way too familiar with this brand of nihilistic, punk social commentary that has, of course, the allusions to World War III now by people who read headlines and nothing else because they don't understand or don't care enough about how this impacts other people's lives. I thought it was basic and worthless in 2006 and even more so in 2020, especially after the year of uprisings we had. Why would I respect anyone who's either going to try to appropriate it with no nuance or crap all over it? You'd think by the end he'd pull out of the tailspin, and on the surface with Drop Dead he tries to emphasize, well, we kept on surviving through this year, we have to keep on going, I'd rather drop dead than quit. But his perpetually nasal and burned out delivery only emphasizes how low the stakes seem to be for him if that's the most intensity he can muster. And more importantly, why would I care when the production on the back half of this album turns to absolute crap, adopting what I'm going to call the Muse Drones approach of by approaching downbeat political album by washing out the mix and desaturated compression and fuzz that leaches out any sense of instrumental color and turns the album completely sterile. At least when 21 Pilots went darker in a similar vein on Trench, they had the heaviness and sense of scale that this album cannot come close to approaching. Yeah, that attempt at blending in the drum machines with the bass tells me all I need to know there. This album feels shockingly underweight in that low end when it tries to drive a groove, no matter how many trap progressions they cram in. Worse still, it manufactures the heavier feeling that this album is deeper than it actually is. And when it feels this unbelievably cynical and detached, especially in 2020, it was the last thing I wanted to hear. And maybe it was assuming this election was going to go a different way, but that's the deadly risk of trying to be topical and only specific in tone, not your content. But outside the bad politics, yeah, when your instrumentation is this colorless, clumsily produced, and derivative, and a lyricist and a frontman here I'm not otherwise impressed by, I'm not recommending it. It says something that Dirty might wind up as the best song here, and it feels like a poor man's Feel It Still with a trap drop.
Strong 3 out of 10. I really didn't like it at all. Maybe it'll play better to a younger, more disaffected audience. But given how dated it already feels, I kind of doubt it. Just saying. And finally, from Playboi Carti, Whole Lot of
Tell
Red.
you shit. When you feel like this, can't nobody tell you shit.
So let's be brutally honest here. Was it all worth the hype? Forget the obvious whole lot of mid jokes I saw the very night this dropped. To me, this just feels like the next coming of Eternal Atake, where the meme about a sugary, overlong trap album, low on content but high on personality, set expectations way higher than they probably should have been. And as someone for whom Playboi Carti has always felt like more ad-libbing squeaky meme than credible MC, and who never really dug Die Lit 2 years ago, watching the backlash to all this was kind of fascinating, but alright, fine. How is it? Well, honestly, the majority of things I could say about Die Lit are just as true this time around, except this project is nowhere near as consistent, and you can tell that Playboi Carti was trying to evolve. Emphasis on trying. The first change is the production. It's rougher, it's more jagged, the synths buzz and spark against the once again overweight trap beats, with some of the most undercooked and faintly embarrassing attempts at gothic elements I've heard in recent memory. But let's be real, for as much as he wants to emphasize how punk or vamp this album is, it has shockingly little impact, especially when the tunes can feel so undercooked, and minus Pierre's consistent presence, the mixed quality is all over the damn place. But once again, even more questionable is Playboi Carti himself, who's trying to show more diversity beyond the husky, faux baby voice he was using, often trying to go for a harsher or lower register. And wow, he can't sell it at all with any power, which is painfully ironic given all the attempts at machismo that run rampant in the content, and say nothing of the homophobia. Again, I'll repeat myself when I cover Die Lit. He's got more texture than intensity in his voice. Only this time around it's worse because he's trying to convey intensity and edginess, and he's flailing with a lot of painfully sloppy flows. And when the album is 24 tracks and over an hour, the broad stretches of try-hard emptiness makes us feel even more hollow. I don't know, it's got the painful feel of somebody who clearly knows they are on their 15th minute. And while Kanye West, Kid Cudi, and Future at least sound a little bit more invested than Die Lit's guest stars, it can't escape the feel of a meme being stretched too far. I mean, I've seen a lot of rappers who are built for short-term bursts or are powered by the meme. They get through on one overpraised album, then they fall off a cliff. Looks like it's happening again. I mean, I said it on Billboard Breakdown, at least the song with Kid Cudi is legit good. And I was surprised how well the soulful touches worked on the closer, so very light 4 out of 10. And man, I feel like I'm being generous. Just saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching, especially all that. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful for all that. Full disclosure, again, a lot of these are albums I just did not like. If they worked for you, all fine and dandy, no hard feelings. We all like things that other people don't like and vice versa. And I've got a third compilation coming up that will really drill into the points that are, let's call them, more contentious on my channel. Stay tuned for that. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in supporting my channel or potentially getting an album on my schedule for me to cover, hopefully not albums as bad as these, the link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, please do not feel obligated to join. Tough times out there for everyone. I get it. I will be fine. But if you want to join, help contribute to my Patreon, get albums on my schedule, join my Discord, there's an opportunity to do so. And yeah, otherwise, thanks a lot for watching. This was the worst of On the Pulse in 2020. I'm Mark, the host of Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.